Perfect. Welcome everyone to today's town hall. Thank you everyone today for joining us on Zoom, Facebook Live, Twitter, and YouTube. Everyone on Zoom except for the speakers will be muted today. If you're on Zoom, you can ask questions in the chat. If you're on Facebook Live, video feed, YouTube, or Twitter, you can type your questions in the comment section and we'll make sure that we see them and that we include them in our video feed. Please be aware that the video feeds that are a minute or two behind the Zoom feed, so it'll be a little bit delayed, but we will make sure we see you and we ask your question on your behalf. Just a quick note on housekeeping. All of the views expressed today are the views of our individual guests. And if you would like to learn more about their guests, we will give you their social media so you can contact them and you can go ahead and get to know more about how they feel and if you would like to support them. My name is Tisa Rodriguez. I'm the chair of the Riverside County Democratic Party. I'm going to introduce our panel today. Liz Lavertu is a mother, a small businesswoman, the chair of the Spring Valley Community Planning Group. She has been an active volunteer in her community. Liz is running for state assembly to advocate for working families and push for policies that will help shape our educational system. 71st Assembly District is East County, San Diego, Idlewild, Anza, Valley Vista, Sage, and more. Liam Amara is a history professor from a working class family of union laborers. Liam has worked as a union longshoreman, a union fry cook, and a computer nerd. He later took on a lot of student debt to finish his PhD and has taught college for 12 years, focusing on the history of ideas. Liam is the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Congressional seat in AD 42, located in southwest Riverside County. Barry Sackin is with us today. He's our very special guest. Barry Sackin is a nationally recognized award-winning school nutritionist veteran with 40 years in the industry. He has been a program operator, vice president of public policy for the School Nutrition Association, and a consultant. There are several pieces of both federal and state legislation that Barry either drafted or influenced. He has been published numerous times in national publications and speaks frequently at state, regional, and national conferences. Kate Schwartz is unable to be with us today, but she'll be back with us next week. Now we're going to get started with a few words from Liz.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again this week and every week as we talk about things that are important facing our state and our nation. When Liam had brought up talking about school lunches, immediately my mind went to, student, lunch debt. And the unfair practices. But today we'll be talking about nutrition for school lunches, which, to be honest, I don't know a lot about other than the fact that I have two kids, one who went through the school system and is now in college, and another one who will be starting high school. So I've seen the different levels of school lunches that are offered. And I'll be honest, when my oldest son went to a charter school for a short period of time, the school lunches there were much more nutritional, much more delicious, and the options were absolutely amazing. It was like ordering off of a menu of a fancy restaurant, which was nice. But as far as school lunches I'm learning with you today. I just believe that when we're looking at the nutritional value, we also have to be looking at the kids not getting shamed, for having lunch debt. I think that's another important piece to school lunches. I know that some school districts are still doing shaming by either making the kids not be able to check out library books if they have lunch debt, or they hold back their report cards if they have lunch debt, or they're not able to get their yearbooks at the end of the year if they have lunch debt. And that's ridiculous, considering that, here in California, our cost of living is way higher than the rest of the nation. And even those that are above the, income level of those who would get, free or reduced lunches, still can't afford to pay for a school lunch. It's, I believe, a month you have to make your family, if you're a family of three, if you make $2,311 a month or less, is when you can get the free student lunches, which, knowing here in Southern California that the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, in San Diego is about $2,200. So that leaves you only $100 extra for other expenses, or in Riverside County, where the average 2-bedroom apartment is $1,590, which, I mean, and that's just your cost of, having a roof over your head, not your additional expenses. So I think we need to look at a national level, localizing what that dollar amount looks like. I think a lot more people should qualify for free and reduced lunches to ensure that our children are getting the proper nutrition to be able to, learn throughout the day. That's a big part of learning, is having the proper nutrition there. And then on another note, there was a time, and this was a few years back, so hopefully they've changed the practice since then, but about 4, maybe 5 years ago, one of my children wasn't given school lunch for 3 or 4 days in a row because our lunch account had gone negative. And as a working mom and, I'm just really busy in the community, I didn't even realize that it went negative. And it wasn't until the 3rd or the 4th day that I was notified that my child was not given lunch and did not eat for multiple days in a row. So, there's another focus there, where students shouldn't be denied a meal just for the inability to pay, or the parents' inability to pay because they didn't realize that they had a lunch debt at the time. So, as we talk today about school nutrition, I think it's a very important thing. And I think that we should also be ensuring that all students have access to a nutritional meal at school. So I look forward to learning with you guys, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz. We're going to go to Liam next for some thoughts.
Hey, hi, Liam O'Mara here, candidate for the 42nd Congressional District. And today we're talking about school lunches, which might seem an odd topic during a pandemic and school shutdown, but to my mind, that actually makes it an important one to address. Because for one thing, the changes that are surely going to be rolled out to school lunch programs as the schools reopen, given the fear of the infectious diseases, we're going to be moving away from buffets and all that kind of stuff there. It's an opportunity to make further changes that damage the entire idea, especially with the sort of people currently working in this administration. And a lot of students have had to adjust to a life without the regularity of that school meal, and many of them depend upon it. So as we adapt and move forward, it seemed worthwhile to me to pause and appreciate just how important they are. Now, taking a step back from this, primary and secondary education are neither free nor a charity. They involve federal, state, and local spending, but the benefit to society of well-performing schools is enormous. We operate schools and provide lunches there for a number of reasons, none of which are ultimately based on the goodness of anyone's heart, because, schools serve to pass on the basic skills and knowledge needed to function in our society. And they impart core values and a sense of identity and belonging. They're thus an integral part of the modern world, and without which a country like ours could not even function. Schools, in fact, played a key role in the creation of modern nation states, helping to assimilate the very peoples within a country's territory into a single political identity. To use Eugene Weber's term from a seminal work of the same title, schools help to turn peasants into Frenchmen. In the same way, they function to create Americans. They're an important part of our whole lives here. But the idea that everyone is entitled to an education and thus to equal participation in our society has been under attack by the right for decades. By cutting per capita education spending, tying it to property values, enforcing class-based and race-based de facto segregation, which incidentally is getting worse, not better, and favoring charter and other private schools, the right hopes to undermine what holds us together as a democracy. One underreported component of this obscene agenda is our school lunch programs. From the very start of the national program in 1946, conservatives have opposed the existence and the goals of it, as well as the creator's desire to include American students of all racial and religious backgrounds and national origins. More than 100 representatives voted against it then, and the number opposed has only grown since. So why do we offer lunches to students at all? There are many reasons depending on your social views, but at the end of the day, you can kind of boil it down to a handful, I guess. First, students are generally forced to be present at school throughout the day. unlike in many countries around the world where students often have the ability to go home for, get a home-cooked meal at lunchtime and then come back. And if the students are trapped at school, then eating is kind of essential. So the next reason, I guess, is physiological. Animals need to eat, and children especially need to eat a lot, given their growth rates and the demands of a learning environment. So a third reason is actually specific to our neurology. The brain is growing rapidly throughout youth, making new neural connections, building tissues. Without proper nutrition, that work cannot proceed well. And that provides a rationale not only for eating in general, but for good foods. So it'll help with the concentration, it helps with brain development. So why not bring a lunch from home, someone might say? Well, I mean, you can, a lot of people do. But here's where poverty comes into play. And what this does is it really highlights for me the real impact of a lot of conservative policies. It really cuts to the core of it. It is a sad fact that we in the United States are already number 2 in the developed world in childhood poverty. That's not a list I wanted us to be on at all. And here we are scraping the top of it. For many students, that school meal is either the best one they will receive that day or the only one they will receive that day. And the evidence is overwhelming that children with proper levels of nutrition are better able to focus and learn, more likely to succeed in school. And by leaving so many people essentially malnourished, we are reproducing generational poverty, condemning people to poorer outcomes in life and harming our entire society and economy. The U.S. costs for school lunches are pretty similar to what we see across the rich world, despite, covering from my perspective too few students. But many of those who are covered have to pay all or part of the cost. Getting to what Liz was pointing to earlier, and to a uniquely American phenomenon called student lunch debt. What are we teaching kids by taking away their food because their parents can't afford to pay for it? We're teaching them to be ashamed of themselves and that our country does not care about poor people. Other countries in the rich world, from France and Germany to much smaller Finland or relatively poorer Greece, tend to provide more nutritious meals without necessarily costing more. And they do so because students just need to eat. Because remember, nutrition is vital to brain development. The relatively small cost of providing basic nutrition for all of our students is easily offset by the greater earning potential of them in adulthood, of all those who benefited from this. And in that sense, it makes a sensible investment in the future of the country as a whole. Many conservatives continue to oppose this kind of sensible investment, which has 2 significant and negative consequences. First, they are contributing to the fall of America from the land of opportunity where the poor could move in, work hard, and see their children thrive. We are now a country where many of our vital socioeconomic statistics make us more comparable to the developing world than to the rest of the rich world. And second, it signals that they are happy to condemn children to malnutrition and disease for no fault of their own. How's that for pro-life, right? Only their parents' relative poverty. Poor or non-existent school lunches entrench this kind of generational poverty, which is then exploited in racist and nationalist rhetoric to defend the very policies which created the problem. At the end of the day, if we want once and for all to be a country with a growing real economy, a thriving and expanding middle class, improving living standards for all, one really good place to start is by improving the way we manage and provide school lunches. And that is where my views give way to Barry's, since he has been championing way to do that for a long time and was kind enough to explain it to me last year, and will now do so to all of you. So,
thank you, Liam and Liz. You threw a whole lot of stuff out and not a lot of time. The school meal program is far more complicated and complex than virtually anybody knows about who's not directly involved in it. And has a long history. I do a 2-day seminar on the history and structure of school meals to help people understand it. We're going to try in a very, very few minutes to sort of get people a little bit up to speed. And there's a lot of things that you talked about that I would love to be able to respond to that we just won't have time for. The school meal program started actually in the 19th century locally, mothers bringing soup to schools in Boston because kids needed food to make it through the school day. During the Depression, and a very relevant point for where we are literally right now in agriculture and children, farmers were growing things that people didn't have money to buy, and we're going to be seeing more of that. I mean, we've seen all the stories of farmers who are literally plowing under food because there's nobody to buy it or to move it, which is a sin under any circumstance. And part of the response of government, of good government back then, was to buy the surplus products that farmers couldn't sell and distribute it to schools and to food pantries, which is what is happening with COVID virus. USDA, which has shown amazing flexibility, and within a oppositional administration, is actually doing a lot of good things within the limits of what they can do to make sure that food is getting out. And there have been a number of programs that have been initiated to do that. So back in the 30s, we started with a commodity program. In response to the dilemma of young men, primarily, well, back then almost exclusively young men, who were called up to serve but were found unfit because of nutrition reasons. In 1946, Congress passed the National School Lunch Act, and in the preamble it says, as a matter of national defense, we need to provide meals to kids in school. In the War on Poverty, in LBJ's War on Poverty, he passed the Child Nutrition Act of 1966. It started a pilot for school breakfast programs and a variety of other things. It also started what we call the 3-tier system of children's eligibility. And Richard Nixon, we have had some surprising champions. Richard Nixon had a White House conference on poverty and on hunger, looking at Appalachia at that time. A great CBS documentary about the fact that this is not a racial issue, it is a poverty issue. And they went to Appalachia, and all these kids who are literally, if we talk about lunch shaming today, kids who were lined up against the wall, who did not bring lunch and couldn't buy lunch, and watched their peers eat meals. So he started the free and reduced meal program. And that's in the mid-60s, and Nixon was a great supporter of school meal programs. Ronald Reagan was not so much, and we had some interesting challenges. He thought that he could, that he wanted to do what's called block grant the program. The program is structured so that we are an entitlement program, performance-based. For every meal a school serves, they get money to pay for the food that they serve children, whether it's a small amount of money for children who can afford to pay or at no cost to the child. And because of his opposition to this, and somebody in his administration came up with the idea of block grants and said, we're going to give states a chunk of money, and they figure out how they want to feed kids, if they want to feed kids, what they do with the money. When that wouldn't pass, and there's a long, interesting, fun history about that. When that didn't pass, he said, well, we can paper them out of existence, and started an incredibly onerous process of administration so that schools spend. I have a friend who testified before Congress, and he had 2 large stacks of paper. One was about 4 inches high, one was 10 inches high. His daughter worked for a nuclear power plant, and he pointed to the short stack and said, this is the paperwork that my daughter is required to file to administer a nuclear power plant, and this is what I have to do to feed kids in school. So we got into a real paperwork nightmare that schools deal with. We can talk a lot about nutrition, or we can talk about economics. The current rules, and they talk about the rollback of the Obama nutrition standards. I had problems with the Obama nutrition standards. They were flawed. I can give you a lot of history on how we got to where they were. They recognized that some of the things they proposed were really bad and undid them fairly quickly. But I guarantee you, we have lost 3 million children out of the school lunch program in the last 10 years. Those children are not getting anywhere near as good a meal as they got even before the new nutrition standards. So we can talk about it, but when we talk about hunger and we talk about nutrition, it is not as simplistic as people would have us believe. It's a much more complicated issue. Right now, I think we are getting more positive recognition of the work and the importance of school meals than we've had in 25 years, since some things we dealt with in the mid-90s. Because with children forced out of schools, parents, households, kids who depend on school meals, we're losing access to them. I am incredibly proud of my colleagues who are doing heroic work at risk to themselves and their families to make sure that meals are still being provided. Depending on the school district, and I've talked to districts across the country, we're serving anywhere between 15 and 50% of the children who are participating before schools close down. The children who are not participating are definitely not getting as good a nutritional outcome as we would like them to. When, Liz, when you were talking about lunch shaming and the economics of it, there's a problem. The food service program must break even. At the end of the year, any losses they experience come out of the general fund, which means there's a teacher or a program that is not going to get funded because they had to pay for the meals. Now, there are some solutions to that, fairly expensive ones. I'm, and have been for my entire 40 years, a believer in universal school meals. We provide textbooks, we provide teachers, provide meals. And there's certain economics that go along with that. But right now, the reimbursement rate for a free meal, the fully paid meal by the federal government, is $3.48. How many of you went to Starbucks sometime in the last week or two and spent $4 or $4.50 or $5 for a cup of coffee? But a school has to provide a nutritious meal, including all of the components, a protein, bread, fruits, vegetables, more fruits and vegetables, and milk, and pay for labor, and pay for overhead, and pay for supplies, and equipment, and everything else that you need to provide for a school meal program for $3.48. When parents can't pay, don't pay, that has to, and you still provide the meal, which you have to do in California as of last year because of the state legislation. Where's that money come from? The other thing that you mentioned, Liz, and this is where Liam and I started our discussion a year or so ago, is what I call regional indexing. It's something I've been working on for well over 25 years. Because the cost of living in California, the eligibility for school meals is the standard nationally in the 48 contiguous states. And it's the same regardless of the cost of living. So the first time I met with a congressman to discuss this in 1993, I think, and I told him I was food service director in Anaheim, California. There was an article in the Orange County Register that Orange County, Anaheim, had the highest cost of living or apartment rental rate in the country. And I took a look at my children. I said, that's a problem. So I went and I met with my local congressman and I said, here's what's going on. And his response was, so you think my children should get something that my colleague from Mississippi's kids don't get? And my answer was, no, they're getting something that your children don't get. It's a matter of equity. The bill that I've drafted, which has been kicking around on the Hill for about 8 or 10 years, is called the Equality and Equity in School Meals Act, because we need to address that problem of the cost of living differential. Unfortunately, it's not inexpensive, and Congress, as Liam rightly pointed out, we need to prioritize nutrition and children's health and school meals above some of the what I would consider less important things that we do with our tax dollars. There's a whole lot more that we could talk about. I said I could go on. We could talk for hours and hours, and I could try and explain some of the nuts and bolts and some of the challenges. But I welcome any questions that people may have if we have time for them.
Yes, absolutely. So let's start by talking a little bit more. Actually, let's take a little bit more of a deep dive on the free and reduced school meal program. So you had told us, Barry, that you've been proposing a bill, but right now, what is the current formula for how someone in a school, how a school district or a program would determine who qualifies for free or reduced lunch? And do you have any idea of what some of the, at least the regional statistics might be on who's actually able to qualify?
There's nothing easy. There are never any simple, straight answers to any question anybody asks about the program. There are applications for school meals that a household can provide, and it's households, not families. So that blended households or multiple families living in one residence are considered a household. And based on the household income and the number of people living in the household, they qualify for free, reduced, or paid meals. Paid meal is a very small subsidy. And one of the things, I mentioned it before in passing, but one of the differences between school meal programs and other entitlement or safety net programs is the money does not go to individuals. So the argument that, food stamps, you're giving people money to buy food, you're giving schools money to provide meals to kids. And there's a substantial difference philosophically in doing that. So you have applications. We have something called direct certification, which is that categorical eligibility. People who have already filled out applications for other safety net programs like SNAP are automatically qualified for school meals. There is a pilot going on using Medicare data, because Medicare data uses, you provide income, and they are able to differentiate income by household so that they can actually have free and reduced approvals based on Medicare data. California is one of the states that's participating in that program. And then we have something called community eligibility, which has been around for about 10 years or so, actually maybe a bit more. And its premise is that if you are qualifying the majority of your eligible students through direct certification, you can have a proxy, you saying they already know that if this percentage of people receive SNAP benefits, then it equates to this number of people who should be eligible, because not everybody applies. California is notoriously bad for qualifying people for SNAP benefits. And so you can feed every child in the school based on a formula, a factor of the number of children who are directly certified to receive school meals. So we have those three basic ways of qualifying kids to receive meal benefits.
So the last one you mentioned is a lot like what happened in my home school district that I went to in Imperial County. They had a number of children who had trouble getting the paperwork together in order to qualify because of the number of migrant households that were mixed status. And then when they just certified the entire school district, suddenly all of the kids were able to just, without question, be able to eat and go to school. Judy writes that the majority of the kids in the Hemet Unified School District are able to qualify for the reduced or free school lunches. So that would be an example of the second one, right, where it's kind of mixed status?
Probably, yes.
All right. So we have a couple of questions here about the expenses, and we have a couple of questions about the quality of the meals. So let's start with the expenses, and then we'll transition to more of the quality of the meals and who's able to in what they're getting on their daily basis. So first, the question is, if a universal school meal programs are overly expensive, how viable or liable is bringing in gardening programs in the local schools to grow their own foods and teaching students valuable life skills? Kind of like the example would be, I guess, what Michelle Obama was trying to.
The school garden programs.
Yeah.
They're a wonderful education tool. They make very little sense in terms of the business model of school food service. They can't produce enough to make a dent in the amount of food that schools need to provide. I like them because, as I said, they're educational, and that's important. Kids have lost sight of or have no experience with where food comes from. It comes from the grocery store. And so we do see lots of positives in terms of nutrition and perception when schools have garden programs. But it's not a viable business model for them. There's a lot of effort going into buy local and farm to school efforts, and the federal government has invested a fair amount in those programs. Once again, the logistics of doing that are complicated. Because one of the biggest fear for all school food service professionals is food poisoning, is foodborne illness. And we teach, their schools are incredibly safe places to eat. When you are buying local, unless you have some really good controls in place, you don't necessarily have the food safety controls that you do through a commercial procurement system. So there's some risks involved in doing that. Is there benefit to it? Yes, both to the local agriculture community as well as to the school. And the matter of fact, I'm going to be doing a program in South Carolina. They got a grant for some farm to school, and they need some education on how to procure farm to school. So there's things that can be done to improve that. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. So the next question is from Facebook. How can we get more plant-based options in schools? I will add to this, there's a history in school lunches of defining, I'm sure you're well aware of this, what is a vegetable and what counts nutritionally for what. So what is that line? Liz, you're a mother who's had kids in the school system, so I'm sure you have some experience with some of this, but I'd love to hear some different thoughts on school, on the ability to bring vegetables, and then of course, Barry, if you can explain to us what the standard is for the fruits, the vegetables, and what counts.
I think there are a couple of things in that question, the way you read it. Having more plant-based, people who are asking for that usually are talking about center of the plate plant-based options, as opposed to fruits and vegetables, which are served in all school meals or made available in all school meals. One of the things that we are challenged with, and there's lots of examples we can provide, is that school food service in this country, because of the nature of media more than anything else and marketing, we have to compete with all of the restaurants and all of the ads. Drives me crazy while schools are trying to provide nutritionally sound, properly caloried meals. You're seeing ads on TV for stuff your face with this or oversized portions. And we have to compete with that because the kids are exposed to all of that. When I was a food service director and I would go out to the schools and I would meet with student groups, and the students would say, we want more salads available at lunch, entree salads. Cool, I'm gonna do that. We will provide them here, but you have to buy them, because if I put 10 salads out and throw 8 of them away at the end of the day, I can't afford to keep doing that. So unfortunately, some of what drives that is marketing and what kids will buy, because at the end of the day, the kid is still a consumer. The child has choice what they do, what they buy, what they eat. So there's an education function involved. I think there's a social marketing question involved. How do we get kids to make healthier choices? And putting the burden on schools to change the mentality, the thinking of kids by forcing schools to serve things that kids won't eat doesn't do anybody any good. So, I talk to many school food service directors who would love to do a lot of things that and when the kids ask for it, they do it. There are some schools doing absolutely incredible things in terms of plant-based meals and other changes in the meal patterns and in the quality of meal service. But the kids have to, at the end of the day, the kids have to participate. The changes that occurred in 2012 for the meal pattern that has been so controversial for the last 8 years, as I said, we've lost 3 million children out of the program because they voted with their feet. They said, we're not going to, we don't like what you're serving. We don't like, it's too bland, or we don't like those items, so it's a more complicated problem. But I guarantee you, if there are children in a school who go to their school food service, the manager in the cafeteria or the director in the district, and say, we want more of this and we will buy it. I'll give you one more example. This goes back almost 40 years. And I went to a school and the student said, we want steak sandwiches. And I said, how much are you willing to spend for a steak sandwich? And they gave me, they gave me a number, and I went out and I found a steak that we could afford to do. And I came back and said, this is how much I'm going to have to charge you for the steak. You want it, I'll provide it. They said, no, we're not going to spend that much money on the sandwich. So there has to be some balance between, parents who say, this is what we want our kids to eat, and kids who actually make the decision at the cafeteria line.
I have a question. So now that, we're living in the life of COVID, and with schools looking to reopen in the fall, what does that school lunch look like? Is it a prepackaged box lunch? No more salad bars, no more going through a line? Like, what does that look like?
What you've just said, this is a discussion that we are literally in the middle of. Our National Association is having a 3-day program in June, talking about what does school look like in September. One, I think, for good or ill, salad bars are not going to happen again. I don't know that they will ever come back, but we'll see what when a vaccine is available and what that looks like. Going through the cafeteria line right now is unlikely. One of the things we're dealing with, and there's an expense involved, is individually wrapped items or packaged meals. We're talking about not having cafeterias open at all and serving in the classrooms, with only half the students present at any one time. So there's a lot we don't know, and we're trying to figure that out. Literally, as we're speaking, we're trying to determine what will schools look like and what will food service look like.
So I know that other countries that have opened back up to the schools have been doing box lunches served in the classroom with a class monitor who is the one who goes and grabs the lunches, and as the kids are wearing masks throughout the day, when it's time to eat, they put up these like plastic dividers, almost like, remember when you were taking the tests and stuff, so that they can take off their masks and eat and still stay safe in the classroom. So that's, an idea that you guys might want to be talking about. But when you were saying about the wrap, each individually wrapped, I mean, obviously, and with these box lunches, we're going to be creating more waste, with the school lunch process. Are we going to be using recycled products, products that are recyclable? Are schools looking at styrofoam, which has been banned in some areas? What does the additional waste look like with school lunches going forward?
It's a good question and a difficult one to give you a clear answer on, because we really don't know right now. Recycling is a wonderful thing, except that food recyclables are very limited. Again, I can give you lots of examples. So the waste issue is certainly one that has to be considered. The ability to recycle, to collect. I mean, I did a program with milk, and I wanted to recycle the pouches that I was buying milk in. But in order to do that, I had to store a container full, and milk spoils and becomes a health issue, and the volume of it, and bringing the empty containers back to a central location so you can build the volume. So it's a fairly complicated question that you ask. And we're going to, industry is very, very concerned about this. There are costs involved in not cooking on site. Schools that cook have lower food costs than schools that buy packaged goods, but they have more supplies costs, they have more labor costs because they have to prepare meals. So it's a very complicated balancing act. What's going to happen, what waste looks like in September is still, we just don't know.
And then I guess my other question regarding food waste now. So now that the children aren't picking up the individual items that they're interested in and it possibly being in a boxed thing, we're going to find a lot of kids who are getting things in the boxes that they wouldn't eat. And so how can we make sure that the food waste is, not wasted and not just thrown in the trash cans? Is there a way to collect items in a, box in each classroom and disinfect them and donate them to, the local food shelters or to communities, or, what does that look like as far as food waste?
It's again, a challenging question. Because of the changes that were mandated in the 2012 meal pattern rules, and the minimum quantities, and kids, small kids can't eat as much food as was being required to provide. USDA put out policy that allows schools to have what are called sharing tables, so that a student can, who wants more can get it. A student doesn't want something, they put it on the sharing table. We've been doing that with milk for 20 plus years. So but in the COVID days, the safety issue becomes very, very critical. Are you going to want to recycle things that another student has touched? So it's a good question. It's one of those things that we're going to have to figure out as we go through it. I mean, on March 13th, schools were told you're closing tomorrow, and school food service people were told on Monday you're going to start serving again. And they literally spent, on the one hand, I wish I were in operations because I know the things I would have been doing. On the other hand, I'm glad I didn't have to deal with it. People spent their weekend, 18 hours a day figuring out how do we feed kids when they're not going to be in school. USDA has provided a lot of flexibility, non-congregate feeding, being able to pick up multiple meals at one time. One of the scenarios that CDC has recommended and the Department of Education has talked about is alternating days. So a child comes to school on one day, and another group of kids come to school the next day. But how do you feed them? Well, when they get their lunch today, they also get tomorrow's breakfast and lunch. So there's a lot of things, and USDA has been absolutely wonderful in providing flexibility to allow us to continue to feed kids. But we just don't have a lot of clear answers. We're learning as we go.
I'd like to bounce off of this question of food waste that Liz brought up, as well as something that Barry had touched on earlier. The question of what the students will actually themselves choose to eat and what just gets thrown right into the trash. And I think that one of the things that's come up for a lot of people in more recent years is, well, you see these nice photo essays of what kids eat in other countries, and oh, look at these French school meals. And then Michael Moore had a segment on that in one of his films and showed like what French school meals are like. And it, in some ways, a lot of that misses the point, because you could produce really good 3-course meals and the kids are still not going to eat them because they're seeing all those billboards and commercials from McDonald's, and that's what they want instead. So part of that, I think, for me, comes down to a kind of corporate culture and media culture where we allow this sort of like heavy advertising directed specifically to children and affecting their tastes. And then the sheer amount of garbage that we produce in terms of processed and packaged food. One big difference that you see in a lot of what we have to do, and some of it just comes from like how little money is available for these school lunches, is you end up with a lot of, processed, canned, frozen sort of items where you have a lot more fresh items in a lot of other developed countries. But again, we're not really conditioned to want that sort of thing anyway, because kids grow up with so much junk food that's packed with all this, the preservatives and the sugars and everything else, which affects your tastes. So trying to get past it is, Barry mentioned this several times, there's a lot of complexities here that we tend to ignore, and people can get caught up in those photo essays about French meals and think, oh, it'd just be as simple as like changing the policy. No, we have to change what we want first. And some of that is in the advertising, some of that's in the home.
You raise a couple of interesting points, Liam. In France and Italy has a similar kind of program. In Italy, there's a chef in each school. The kids come in and they get meals. And in France, and one of the things that we're seeing in France, because of this media blitz that kids are exposed to, they are rejecting that kind of food. And there's a big concern in France, which has a strong culture of food and eating and gastronomie, that kids are losing touch with that. And so they are looking at how do we inculcate, how do we bring that food culture back into children. Same thing in Italy. So you're talking about a culture change, which I would welcome. The other thing that you said, which I take a little issue with because of changes that have been happening for a long time that have accelerated, you're seeing in many schools where it is feasible, a lot more fresh food, a lot more produced on site, a lot more fresh fruits and vegetables. And I think that's becoming more prevalent on the one hand. On the other hand, when I was food service director in Anaheim, I oversaw the high school district and the largest elementary district. I had 22 elementary schools that were built without kitchens and dining rooms. I set up tables outside and kids picked up their food, and it was a strong program considering the limitations of what I had to work with. So our culture is not designed for the kind of eating we would like to see families and children have. It's a side issue, but related. You know, when our kids were growing up, dinner was a family affair. And there's lots of evidence in the educational literature that families that eat together have more wholesome children, better educated, better adjusted children. You know, two working parents, kids may not have that opportunity. The culture doesn't really support that approach to eating as more than just providing food so that you can function.
Yeah, and there's certainly been a lot of improvements. I mean, it's not like we had in the 1990s where it was a bunch of like frozen pizzas and whatnot. We've definitely, I mean, I'm not to say that, you know, U.S. schools are that bad off, but I think it's more a matter of how this sort of appears to a lot of people when you see the schools of the chefs and like, oh, that's not what my kid's getting. And it's still, there's a comparison thing there. And there's a danger too in, yes, there is a cultural issue. Some of that does come down to us and to the families and whatnot there. But culture is also shaped by circumstances. And the advertising culture and the sort of things that we allow in advertising are a factor in that. I mean, and as well as, I mean, you mentioned that two parents are working, which means our entire work culture. The fact that, you know, even as productivity has climbed, we have had people working more and more hours for less and less, means less time with your kids, less home cooked meals, less actual, you know, psychological conditioning to have a good meal. You little packaged food or fast food is what you grow up with. So it's back to.
I want to give you a quick funny story. A very good friend of mine was food service director in Glendale, and his superintendent called him one day and said, "I have an angry parent, please give her a call." So he calls the parent, and Rick was doing a lot of very innovative things, and he had McDonald's on each elementary school once a week. And the parent was calling to complain, and you know, this was the 90s, and it was, you know, the way of the world. And the parent was calling to complain about the McDonald's. And he says, "I only do it once a week," and yada, yada. And she said, "Oh, no, I'm not mad that you're serving it. I was taking my kids to McDonald's for dinner tonight."
Yeah, and some of this has been going on for a long, I mean, it's not like this is all new. I mean, look at the rise of like TV dinners in the 70s, and then everyone had microwaves. And
Liam, TV dinners in the 50s.
I grew up I grew up as a kid with all that kind of stuff, though. I mean, it became the norm. I mean, my grandparents still cooked all the time. My mother, it was TV dinners and microwave stuff, and then we went as a treat to McDonald's regularly. And it went from McDonald's being a thing you did once a week to being, as people have to work more and more, something that especially poor parents have to do over and over and over again, which again conditions the taste buds. It gets you wanting that kind of heavily processed, sugar-packed garbage. And that, again, complicates how can we really change the culture to want better nutrition, because there are consequences to what we're
eating. There's another factor, and you alluded to it much earlier, and you know, we have, unfortunately, too many children whose families live in motels, and when they get kicked out of one, they move into another motel. I was speaking at the Rotary Club in Anaheim whatever, have 15, 16 years ago. And it was a holiday time, and the gentleman who spoke before me talked about they would do this food giveaway. They would bring food baskets, because people only have to eat at the holidays. It's not important that they eat all year round. And he said that he had his, the frozen turkey and the can of cranberry sauce and, the stuff that he was bringing to the household. And he was absolutely aghast because there was no stove and there was no refrigerator. How are those people supposed to prepare meals when they don't have the basic tools to be able to provide? A friend of mine, Chef Bruno, at the White House in Anaheim, has a program providing pasta to kids, and it's grown to be a very large program, and focused on these kids who live in motels, and their food options, if he weren't providing this dinner meal for them, is throwing money in a vending machine and eating a bag of chips, because they have no option for eating better. And so there's a larger societal issue that needs to be addressed.
So we gave out, I've participated in a number of those feed a family, adopt a family for Christmas. We just give them gift cards for some restaurant, because if you look up the address and it's the Motel 6, they're not cooking. It's
Right.
That's just the way it's going to be. So right before we go to our closing statements, I'm going to just throw one more thing out there that we have not touched on yet, and that's school lunches and allergies. So we've heard quite a lot about, there's a lot of chatter on the internet. You can probably find any group you want to talk about peanuts and some of the others, but things like veggie burgers, what's the reality with school allergies and school lunches and the options, especially now?
The law requires schools to provide accommodation for medically directed special diets with certain limitations. And schools are required to do that where they are able to. Schools do a fairly good job of making sure there are alternatives and options, but there's a liability involved in doing so. If a parent says, I want my child to have this, this, and this, because he's allergic or she's allergic, and in fact, you might do harm when you do that. So there's the rules require a doctor's prescribed diet modification, and schools do that. Milk is a big issue, and certainly the vegan community has a problem with milk being served in schools. One of the things that we know is that the non-dairy milk alternatives, they have to be fortified and flavored. They are all more expensive. How do you do that? What qualifies as a reasonable substitute? So it's as I've said, everything in this is far more complicated than the simplistic question that, well, what about this? There's a lot more. It's an iceberg. You see this much, but there's all of this stuff underneath it that schools are responsible for and have to address.
No, for sure. And you raised the question about milk there. I've seen a number of medical research articles tying milk consumption to asthma and allergies developing in people. And if it's sort of like it's a required standard. I mean, my mother ran a child care center out of her house for decades, and it was required that she gave milk to them. And so many kids are developing severe allergies and asthma now. So it's hard to know. I mean, again, what do we do about that? And if the information changes in the research, how do you constantly reformulate all the plans here? It affects so many different areas. We end up with it's often so easy to come up, just fix this, but it actually touches so many other, what do you do? How do you replace it? Right.
Very complicated.
So now we're going to go to final statements. We'll do a couple of minutes. The order we're going to go in is Barry first, then Liam, and then Liz, and then we'll give you a preview of next week.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this stuff. We've covered a bunch of territory and barely scratched the surface. It is a far more complicated program and issue than people think it is. And it's certainly something that's important and merits people spending time with it. You as candidates will hopefully have some opportunities to deal with these issues when you're elected on a legislative front. And I'd be more than happy to help shape those policies and laws with you.
Liam.
All right. One of the reasons that this sort of appeals to me as an important topic, really, I mean, there's a ton of issues that concern me, tons of discrete issues, but they all have a central theme. And that is our declining living standards and the real economy. Less than half of the population of the Inland Empire even makes a living wage. And when people are getting poorer, their kids are malnourished, and that malnourishment is going to affect their outcomes, which just deepens this over and over. We just continue to build this problem. So we really have to tackle some of these structural issues here instead of just slapping Band-Aids on individual problems. Just to do a quick plug for next week, we're going to have Stephen Campbell, who is an economic historian, and he's going to lay out some of the foundations here for how recessions and depressions have worked out, and what we're moving into here is similar and different. And then I'm going to talk about some of the possible solutions there, ways forward. So it should be an interesting discussion here. Hope you guys can join us for that. I'm Liam O'Mara.
And the last word goes to Liz. We can't hear you yet.
Okay, now you can hear me. Yep, Liz Lavertu, running for state assembly in the 71st Assembly District. I'm texting back and forth with one of my friends who lives in the district, Marilyn, and she's really sad about school lunches and where it's going, and I have to agree with her. The fact that in the pandemic, the salad bar, we know Soup Plantation's gone. Salad bars in general are going to be gone. I think we really need to look and focus on, getting those prepackaged salads, for students to choose from to ensure that, plant-based choices are available. When I go to a convenience store or, you go to Starbucks, you go to Coffee Bean and Tea Leaf, wherever you go, all the salads are prepackaged. And I think that we could probably find a way to make that happen. But I think my biggest concerns come with the additional waste in our landfills that the new lunch system is going to cause, and how to solve that. And then also the food waste and how we can solve food waste. There are so many people in our communities that go hungry every single day, and there's so much food going into the garbage can at every single school in the district. I feel like there is a partnership to be made there somewhere to ensure that we can not only feed our students, but we can help feed our community as well. And then from the nutrition standpoint, I know that there's nutrition standards. I've been volunteering the past few months in Lakeside, giving out meals to children, ages 2 to 18, in partnership with Heaven's Window and San Diego Food Bank, to ensure that the kids who aren't going to school right now, at least get one meal a day. And yesterday we were handing out multiple meals because we won't be there on Monday because of the holiday. But and just seeing what is the FDA approved meals is kind of sad. I want to say incorrect. That ketchup counted as one of the food groups on one of them, and and there's like these little packages of peanut butter that added to their protein intake. And I think, and I know that we had to really rush into this thought process of feeding kids on the go in these parks and in front of schools, and school bus delivery quickly. But I think that looking at these new the new future, that we should ensure that there's a little bit more tasty and deliciousness and colorfulness. I think it's Italy that the requirements is that it's tasty and colorful is is the thing. But yeah, I think we can do better as far as choices and as far as waste goes. And I hope to Liam can do that at the federal level, and I'd hope to implement something at the state level too, to ensure that our students are getting fed. So thank you so much. See you guys next week.
All right, everyone, that's our time for this week. Thank you so much for coming. We have had an incredible incredible discussion today. Next week we'll be talking about, as Liam said, we'll be talking about the economics of recession with Dr. Stephen Campbell. That's going to be an incredible discussion also. Please bring your questions. We'd love to have them. Dr. Campbell will be able to really answer some things for us, and it'll be a fantastic discussion. The week after that, we're going to be talking about disabilities rights, and our special guest at that time will be former congressional candidate in Oregon, Amanda Seavey. This is going to be another critical discussion, something we want to make sure we highlight in our world, and we have a real opportunity to take some personal action. So we want to invite you all to that. Until then, stay safe. Keep your head up, and we'll all get through this together. Thank you.